What's up, everybody? Logan here with Logan Built. Tonight, I'm going to take a few minutes and go over some questions that I've gotten since the release of my two-speed 400s. A lot of you guys want to know why not a Powerglide, why the two-speed versus that, and then several people had called and left comments and messages asking some more specific questions. So I got a list of everybody's questions here. So let's just take a few minutes here and run through why you want a two-speed versus a Powerglide, or when the Powerglide is a better option for you. So the first question here is, what are the main / biggest benefits to this two-speed 400 versus a Powerglide built to hold the same power? So right off the rip, the first thing that you're going to notice is the price. A 1500 plus horsepower Powerglide is going to cost you about $7,000 to $8,000. And the reason for this is you really need an SFI case at that power level for strength reasons with the Powerglide. And the gear sets that you're going to need to have the proper starting line ratio at 1500 plus horsepower are quite a bit expensive in the Powerglide. So just the gear ratios alone can cost around $2,500. With the Powerglide, the best starting line gear you can get, so the best first gear, is going to be a 158. And those are very expensive and hard to get. Commonly, the most common first gear ratio is going to be a 169. So with the two-speed 400, we're able to use the OEM gears, which is saving quite a bit of cost there. We're able to use the OEM case. So that is really where the two main cost savings come into effect. And so it makes it about 40% cheaper versus the Powerglide for the same power level. And then because we're using the OEM gears, we're moving first gear. Second gear now becomes our first gear, and that's a 148 ratio. So that 148 ratio is a lot closer to 1-to-1. So not only does that allow you to leave the starting line with a lot more power, more consistently without chance of losing the tire, it also helps keep the tire in check down track when it makes the 1-2 shift. It's only going from a 148 to a 1-0, as to where on the Powerglide, it's going from a 169 to a 1-0, quite a bit different, quite a bit bigger shift drop. So if you have a tight converter, you're going to see a bunch of shift drop on that thing. I've seen the wrong converter combos and Powerglides before with the 169 first, and I've seen shift drops as bad as 14 to 1600 RPMs, as to where the two-speed 400 with the 148, even if your converter is a little bit on the tight side, that thing's not going to drop more than 800 RPM. Shift drop's a big deal. It's a big change on the chassis. It drags the engine down into the torque. And something like an LS, where they don't like a bunch of torque, it's a lot safer on the engine with the 148 first gear ratio. So that's really the big difference, meat and potatoes, between the two. So now let's get into a little bit more specific questions that you guys had. So this next question here, is there an application where you would actually benefit from the Powerglide versus the 400? Yes. Realistically, anything under 1300 horsepower. So if you have a race car in that, say, 7 to 1300-ish horsepower range, the Powerglide might actually be a better option for you. Typically, if you don't have a bunch of power, then you can't really take advantage of the high first gear ratio in the two-speed 400 anyways. You might actually benefit far more from, say, a 189 first gear, and as to what you would get in the Powerglide. You're still going to have to buy an aftermarket gear set. You're not going to want to run a stock gear set Powerglide, but some of those ratios are a little bit cheaper. So you can actually put a Powerglide at that power level together for about the same cost as what the 400 would be. And you don't really have the power to take advantage of that 148 first gear anyways. So you really are not, if anything, you're actually going backwards by starting with the two-speed 400. But if you have any plans of moving beyond 1500 horsepower during the life of your build, it is far cheaper to start with the two-speed 400. The conversion from Powerglide to 400 isn't too bad, but anytime that you are having to sell stuff and buy new stuff, you're always spending what I call backwards money. So if you have 1,000+ horsepower car and your goal is to get beyond the 1,500 horsepower range, I would suggest just going ahead and starting with the 2-speed 400. If you have a car that doesn't make that much power, it's never going to make that much power, say you're going to bracket race it or something, then you're totally fine to stick with the Powerglide. And then the next question we have here is, how much cheaper is the 2-speed 400 versus a Powerglide built to handle 1,500+ horsepower? So it's about 40%. That, like I said, the Powerglide is going to cost you $7 to $8 for and closest thing you can get to apples. The 2-speed 400 is about $4,500 average, depending on if you need a dump or not. So quite a bit cheaper than the appropriate Powerglide you would need. And then this person asked, other than toughness, why not build a Powerglide? The 400's benefit is the extra gear. Not sure why everyone isn't jumping on the 6 and 8-speed bandwagon. And that's actually a really great question. We covered pretty much everything in that question except for the end of it, where he's wanting to know why people aren't jumping on 6 and 8-speed stuff. Especially in no prep, that's really the opposite direction of what you want to go. We like the 2-speed stuff because you only have to make one shift. You're starting off as close as you can get to 1-to-1 with still having enough ratio in it to actually make the thing 60 foot well, but you don't have a bunch of shifts to make. So anytime that a transmission is shifting, it is not pulling. So if you watch a G meter, it's going to fall way off on the shift, and then it's going to spike way back up when it actually completes the shift. So basically, imagine the car is nose diving over. So when it's nose diving, you're taking load off of the rear tire, and then once it makes the shift, well, now all of a sudden it's making a bunch of power again, and so now you're trying to jerk the power back in on that tire. If you're on a bad surface, if you're in one of these tracks that's really bumpy, maybe you're on a transition when that happens, and then the tire wants to go up in smoke. So ideally for no prep, you want to shift that thing as little as possible, so that way you don't have to worry about losing the tire down track. And then this is another question that I've gotten a couple times here is, why the stock case over an SFI case? And the main reason for that, again, is cost. The goal of these 2-speed 400s that I'm building right now is to cater to the cheaper side of things. I'm trying to have a budget-friendly transmission that more people can afford. The SFI 400 case stuff right now is really pricey. By the time you do a bell, a main case, and the tail cone, you're talking about $3,000 added to the price. At that point, you're back in Powerglide territory. So then we have a whole new argument of Powerglide versus 2-speed 400. Now, really, the SFI case stuff, in my opinion, doesn't start to become a necessity until you're 2,500+ horsepower, and at that point, you're way outside of the realm of what a Powerglide is really capable of holding. The 400 parts are just so much larger internally, and there's way more aftermarket support at that power level. But that's talking non-budget friendly type stuff, and for me right now, I'm trying to stick with the small tire, true street, no prep style cars that just don't need a $10,000 transmission, that can get exactly what they need out of a $4,500 transmission. This question here is, will my Powerglide converter work in the 400? And the good answer is yes. The Powerglide, the first thing you're going to do with that thing, if you're building one to hold any sort of power, is you're going to upgrade to the larger input shaft, which is the same input shaft that these 2-speed 400s run. So if you have a Powerglide converter and you really like your converter and it's already figured out, you can keep it. So that's a really nice benefit from swapping from the Powerglide to the 400, is you don't have to buy a new converter. And then that kind of rolls into our next question here, which is, what changes will I have to make if I want to change my car over from a Powerglide to this 400? And the good answer there is that not many, because the converter is the same, that stays the same. We can actually do a tail cone that makes the 2-speed or any 400 the same physical length as the Powerglide. So your drive shaft stays the same. Physically, it's a bolt-in deal. Depending on if you need clean neutral or not, if you don't need clean neutral, your 2-speed Powerglide shifter that you already have will work, so you don't have to buy a shifter there either. Now, there are some cars out there that you have to watch the size of the tunnel hump. I know that in the Buicks, like the 200R, a lot of the guys will stick with the 200R simply because they cannot fit a 400 case and bell inside the tunnel hump of their car without making modifications. So that is something to keep in mind, is if your car will physically fit the 400 or not, but in most cases it will. And then the last question that I've had here is, can I get a 160 ratio first gear for the 2-speed 400? So basically, we're talking at that point, we're talking aftermarket ratios. The answer for that is kind of yes. The closest first gear that you can get is a 158. And that's because we are essentially using the second gear. We're removing the first gear. And so with an aftermarket gear set, 158 second gear is the shortest second gear that you can get. So yes, technically we could build one like that. And then we could even build them, if you had a bunch of horsepower and you wanted to leave with even more ratio out of it, we could get the 130 ratios. The thing I'll say about that is that's where we're starting to creep up on the price. We're starting to get out of the entry level realm and more into spending some money. Because we have to buy the aftermarket gear sets, we're not able to run the stock gear set, so the cost will go up. But yes, it's possible, and there's actually quite a bit of options on that as well. So just wanted to take a few minutes here tonight and answer some of the frequently asked questions that I have. And then I wanted to add a question of my own into this and an answer for it. So something that nobody has asked me yet that I'm really surprised about is, what is the weight difference between the Powerglide and the 400, specifically this 2-speed 400 that I am selling? And from the research that I have done, the lightest Powerglide that you can get dry, of course, with no converter, is 100 pounds. The heavier ones with the SFI cases end up being around 120, but it looks like the average weight of a stock case Powerglide built for racing is going to be around 105 pounds. These 2-speed 400s, dry, no fluid in them with no converter, are 118 pounds. So they're only about 13 pounds heavier than your Powerglide. So not a big difference there. Yes, 13 pounds is weight. Because they have a little bit larger gear sets, they are a little bit more rotating mass, so they do take a little bit of horsepower away. But what you're giving up in weight and horsepower far outweighs what you gain in starting line ratio, shift drop, reliability, and the platform to be able to go as far as you want to go. There's cars making 5,000 horsepower on turbo 400s. The fastest quarter mile pro mod car in the world is running a turbo 400. So the nice thing about the 400 is the sky is the limit. You could take it as far as your budget and racing career wants. So that's all I got for this one, guys. Just want to take a few minutes to go over some questions. If you have some more questions that I did not address in this, drop them in the comments below, and I'll make a second video answering your guys' questions. That's all I got for this one. Thanks for watching. If you're new here, click the like button. Helps me get the content out to more people. Click the subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of my latest videos, transmission, racing, etc. And I appreciate it, and we'll see you on the next one.